Picture the North Sea at dawn, silver mist rolling over black water, and a sound rising through the fog, the rhythmic groan of oak against oar. On the coast of Northumbria, in the summer of 793, the monks of Lindisfarne wake to prayer bells, unaware that ships shaped like serpents are gliding toward their shore. Within hours, the world they know will end. Fire will consume the monastery. Blood will stain the altar. And a word will enter the chronicles of Europe that will echo in terror for the next 3 centuries: Northmen. But who were they, really? Not the horned helmet barbarians of Hollywood, nor the mindless raiders of medieval propaganda, but farmers, poets, explorers, lawmakers, and traders who reshaped the map of the medieval world from Newfoundland to Baghdad. They buried their dead in ships built for the afterlife. They governed themselves in open-air assemblies where even kings could be challenged. They sailed further than any European civilization before them, discovering lands that would not be rediscovered for 500 years. This is the story of the Vikings, not as myth, but as history. A story of ice and fire, of gods and gold, of longships slicing through unknown waters, and of a Scandinavian world whose ambitions were larger, stranger, and far more human than legend ever allowed. To understand the Vikings is to understand how a handful of northern farmers became the architects of an age. We begin not with a battle, but with a boat. The story of the Vikings does not begin with an axe. It begins with a keel, a single, curved plank of oak, laid down in a boatyard on the fjords of western Norway sometime in the 8th century. To understand why Scandinavian farmers became the most feared and far-reaching seafarers of the medieval world, one must first understand the land that produced them, a land of narrow valleys pinched between mountains and sea, of short growing seasons and long winters, of scattered farmsteads separated by water rather than roads. In Scandinavia, the sea was not a barrier. It was the highway. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia was a patchwork of chiefdoms and petty kingdoms, in what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, bound together by kinship, trade, and a shared, oral warrior culture rooted in the worship of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Society was organized around the farm, the extended family, and the thing, a local assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, pass judgments, and make collective decisions. Power was not absolute. Even a king who overstepped his authority could, in theory, be challenged at the thing. This legal culture, often overshadowed by the violence for which the Vikings became infamous, would prove to be one of their most enduring legacies, echoing centuries later in early parliamentary traditions across northern Europe. Yet Scandinavia in the 8th century faced a structural problem: population growth without proportional farmland. Norway's arable soil was confined to slivers of coastal and valley land. Denmark had more usable farmland but a rigid hierarchy of petty kings competing for dominance. Sweden's future wealth lay eastward, along the river networks of what is now Russia. Younger sons, without inheritance rights to shrinking family farms, faced a stark choice: serve a chieftain, emigrate, or raid. The technology that made the third option possible had been quietly perfected over generations: the longship. Scandinavian shipbuilders had spent centuries refining a vessel unlike anything else in Europe. Using the clinker-built method, overlapping oak planks fastened with iron rivets over a flexible internal frame, Norse shipwrights built hulls that could flex with the waves rather than break against them. A shallow draft allowed longships to sail in water barely a meter deep, letting raiders strike rivers and estuaries far inland, then vanish before any organized defense could respond. A single mast with a square sail allowed for ocean crossings under wind power, while banks of oars gave crews control in coastal maneuvering and battle. The result was the most versatile warship and cargo vessel hybrid in the medieval world, capable of crossing open ocean to Iceland, navigating the shallow Seine to besiege Paris, or portaging across land between Russian rivers to reach the Caspian Sea. The events of 793 at the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria in northeastern England, marked the conventional beginning of the so-called Viking Age in the historical record, though smaller raids likely preceded it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the attack in the language of divine punishment, fiery dragons seen in the sky, famine following the violence, the harrowing inroads of heathen men, who destroyed God's church, by rapine and slaughter. Alcuin of York, a scholar at the court of Charlemagne, wrote in horror that never before had such an atrocity been seen in Britain, a place where, he noted bitterly, pagans had desecrated the shrine of Saint Cuthbert. For the monks of Lindisfarne, undefended and unprepared, the raid was a massacre, some killed outright, others taken as slaves, the monastery's treasures, chalices, reliquaries, gold and silver ornaments, loaded onto ships and carried back across the North Sea. What followed was not a single invasion but nearly 3 centuries of shifting, opportunistic, and increasingly organized Scandinavian expansion, often described in 3 overlapping and debated phases: raiding, then settlement and conquest, then integration into the medieval political and religious mainstream. Monasteries were a favored early target, not out of particular religious hatred, but because they were wealthy, poorly defended, and often located on exposed coastlines or riverbanks, since Christian communities had built there for centuries without fear of seaborne attack. Iona, off the coast of Scotland, was raided repeatedly in the following decades. Monastic communities across Ireland, Francia, and England learned, at devastating cost, that the age of undefended coastal wealth was over. As raids intensified through the 9th century, Scandinavian ambitions grew correspondingly larger. In England, what had begun as smash-and-grab raiding evolved into sustained campaigns of conquest. In 865, a coalition of Scandinavian forces that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, not a raiding party seeking plunder and a quick retreat, but an army intent on conquest and settlement. Led by figures the sagas and chronicles associate with names like Ivar, Halfdan, and Guthrum, the Great Heathen Army toppled the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, conquered East Anglia, and overran much of Mercia. Only Wessex, under King Alfred, held out, and even Alfred was driven into hiding in the marshes of Somerset in the winter of 878 before rallying his forces for a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. The subsequent treaty between Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum formally divided England, the Anglo-Saxon south and west under Alfred, and the Danelaw, a vast swath of eastern and northern England, under Scandinavian law and settlement. Place names ending in by and Thorpe, still scattered across modern Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, are linguistic fossils of this settlement: Whitby, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Norse words fused permanently into the English landscape. In Ireland, Scandinavian raiders turned settlers founded fortified trading towns that would become some of Ireland's most important cities. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all began as Norse longford, ship enclosures that grew into permanent urban settlements. Dublin, in particular, became a major hub of the Norse slave trade, connecting the Irish Sea to markets as far away as the Islamic world. Irish kings fought, allied with, intermarried with, and were sometimes conquered by these Norse Gael dynasties for generations, culminating in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, a complex struggle in which the Irish High King Brian Boru broke Norse Gael power in Ireland, though Brian himself was killed in the fighting. In Francia, Scandinavian fleets found a wealthy but politically fragmented target. The Carolingian Empire, divided among the descendants of Charlemagne after 843, struggled to defend its long, exposed river systems, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, against fleets that could strike inland and disappear before a response could be organized. Paris itself was besieged in 845 and again, most famously, in 885 to 886, when a Viking fleet reportedly numbering in the hundreds of ships blockaded the city on the Seine for nearly a year, only withdrawing after receiving tribute and, according to some accounts, permission to raid further upriver into Burgundy. Frankish rulers increasingly resorted to paying tribute, a practice that became known as Danegeld when adopted in England, to buy off Viking fleets, a policy that provided short-term relief but often encouraged further raiding. One of the most consequential outcomes of this Frankish struggle came in 911, when the West Frankish king Charles the Simple granted a Viking leader named Rollo control over a territory around the Lower Seine, in exchange for Rollo's conversion to Christianity and his nominal loyalty to the French crown. This territory became known as Normandy, literally, land of the Northmen. Rollo's descendants adopted the French language, Frankish feudal customs, and Christian religion, blending Norse and Frankish traditions into a distinct Norman culture. It was Rollo's descendant, William, Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 would cross the English Channel and conquer England at the Battle of Hastings, meaning that the same Scandinavian expansion that terrorized 9th-century Europe ultimately produced, through Norman conquest, one of the most transformative dynasties in English history. While Western Viking activity is the best known in popular memory, Eastern Scandinavian expansion, largely from what is now Sweden, followed a different pattern, oriented not around plunder raids but around riverborne trade and tribute-taking across the vast waterways of Eastern Europe. Swedish traders and warriors, known to Slavic and Byzantine sources as the Rus, pushed down the Volga and Dnieper river systems, establishing trading posts and eventually political dominance over Slavic populations. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a later medieval source whose reliability is debated by historians, Slavic tribes around Novgorod invited a Rus leader named Rurik to rule over them around 862, founding a dynasty that would eventually establish Kiev as its capital. Whether or not the invitation narrative reflects real events or later political myth-making, archaeological and textual evidence confirms substantial Scandinavian presence and influence in the formation of what became Kievan Rus, the state widely regarded as a foundational precursor to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The very name Russia is generally traced back to Rus. These river routes connected Scandinavia to a trading world of staggering scale. Rus merchants carried furs, amber, walrus ivory, and enslaved captives south along the Volga and Dnieper to Constantinople and, via Caspian routes, into the Abbasid Caliphate, returning north with silver dirhams, silk, and spices. Thousands of Islamic silver coins, minted in cities as distant as Baghdad and Samarkand, have been unearthed by archaeologists in Scandinavian hoards, physical proof of a trade network stretching nearly 9,000 kilometers from the Swedish heartland to the courts of the Abbasid Caliphate. One of the most vivid surviving accounts of this world comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and writer who encountered Rus traders on the Volga in 921 to 922 and left a detailed, often startling description of their customs, appearance, hygiene practices, and, in one especially well-documented episode, the elaborate ship burial funeral of a Rus chieftain, complete with grave goods, animal sacrifice, and a human sacrifice performed by a slave woman who volunteered to accompany her master into death. Ibn Fadlan's account, controversial and debated among historians for its reliability and bias, remains one of the richest outside descriptions of Norse-influenced society in the East. Scandinavian ambition was not confined to Europe and the Near East, it reached, remarkably, into the open Atlantic. Norse sailors, pushed by the same combination of overpopulation, political conflict, and maritime skill that drove raiding elsewhere, began settling the North Atlantic islands in the 9th century. The Faroe Islands and Iceland were settled by Norwegian farmers fleeing, according to later saga tradition, the centralizing rule of King Harald Fairhair, who sought to unify Norway's petty kingdoms under a single crown. Iceland's settlement, beginning around 874 according to the Landnámabók, Book of Settlements, created a unique society, a colony with no king, governed instead by a confederation of chieftains who met annually at the Althing, an open-air assembly at Ingvellir often cited as one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institutions in the world. From Iceland, Norse expansion pushed further west. Around 985, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, explored and settled the coast of a large landmass he named, with calculated marketing rather than accuracy, Greenland, hoping the appealing name would attract colonists to its harsh, icebound coastline. Eric's settlement succeeded for a time, establishing 2 colonies that would persist for centuries before eventually disappearing, likely due to a combination of climate cooling, resource depletion, isolation, and conflict with the indigenous Thule people. It was Eric's son, Leif Erikson, who, according to Icelandic sagas, later spectacularly confirmed by archaeology, sailed even further west around the year 1000, reaching the coast of North America. Excavations at L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, conducted beginning in the 1960s by archaeologists Helga Ann and Stein Ingstad, uncovered the remains of a genuine Norse settlement, complete with ironworking evidence and structures matching Icelandic building styles, the only confirmed pre-Columbian European settlement in the Americas, and recently dated through tree ring analysis to precisely the year 1021. The sagas describe conflict with indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, and the North American settlement was ultimately abandoned, likely due to its distance from Greenland, insufficient numbers of colonists, and hostility from indigenous populations who vastly outnumbered the Norse newcomers. 5 centuries before Columbus, Europeans had already reached the shores of North America, and quietly left. Behind the raiding, trading, and colonizing lay a religious and cultural world often reduced, in popular imagination, to horned helmets and berserker rage, much of it inaccurate. The horned helmet, in particular, is a 19th-century Romantic invention with no archaeological basis. Actual Viking Age helmets, of which only a handful survive intact, were simple iron or leather constructions without ornamental horns. Norse religion centered on a pantheon of gods: Odin, god of wisdom, war, and poetry; Thor, protector of humanity and wielder of the hammer Mjolnir; Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and also war and death, worshipped not through centralized temples and priesthoods in the manner of organized state religions, but through household ritual, seasonal sacrifice, blot, and oral poetic tradition. This mythology, later preserved and shaped by Christian Icelandic writers like Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, long after conversion, survives today primarily through texts like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, works that must be read with awareness of their later, Christianized context. Norse society, contrary to the singular image of raiding war bands, was overwhelmingly agrarian and domestic. Most Scandinavians of the Viking Age never set foot on a raiding ship; they farmed, fished, raised livestock, and worked as smiths, weavers, and traders. Norse women held a notably significant, though not equal, degree of legal and economic authority compared to women elsewhere in contemporary Europe, they could own property, initiate divorce, and manage farms and trade in a husband's absence, and burial evidence, including richly furnished graves like the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, suggests some women held considerable status and possibly religious or political authority. The debated 2017 reanalysis of a warrior grave in Birka, Sweden, long assumed male based on the weapons buried within it, as biologically female reopened scholarly debate about the roles women may have played even in martial contexts, though the interpretation remains contested among historians and archaeologists. Slavery was a foundational, often overlooked, pillar of the Viking economy. Thralls, enslaved people captured through raiding across Ireland, Britain, Francia, and Slavic territories, or born into bondage, performed essential agricultural and domestic labor and were themselves a major trade commodity, sold through hubs like Dublin and along the eastern river routes into Islamic markets. This dimension of Norse society sits uncomfortably alongside romanticized modern portrayals of Viking freedom and adventure, and historians increasingly emphasize it as central rather than peripheral to understanding the period's economy. The gradual conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, occurring at different rates across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden between roughly the 10th and 12th centuries, transformed Norse society from within. Danish King Harald Bluetooth, whose name, centuries later, would inspire the branding of a wireless technology intended to unite devices as he claimed to unite Denmark, proclaimed his conversion and that of his kingdom around 965, commemorated on the Jelling stones, sometimes called Denmark's birth certificate. Norway's conversion, associated with Kings Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, was considerably more violent and contested, involving the destruction of pagan temples and, according to saga tradition, forced conversions. Sweden's transition was the slowest, with pagan worship persisting at sites like Uppsala into the 11th and even 12th centuries. Conversion brought Scandinavia formally into the political and cultural framework of Christian Europe, ended the religious otherness that had partly defined the Viking raids in the eyes of chroniclers, and gradually dissolved the distinct cultural identity of the Viking as a raiding outsider. By the mid-11th century, the age of large-scale Scandinavian raiding and independent conquest was closing, though its final chapter was dramatic. In 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a formidable warrior king who had once served as a mercenary in the elite Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, invaded England, claiming the throne. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwin's son, in a battle many historians consider the true symbolic end of the Viking Age. Weeks later, in a twist of historical irony, the exhausted English army marched south to face William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of the Viking Rollo, at the Battle of Hastings, where Harold was killed and Norman rule began. The Viking Age, in a sense, was bracketed by two related conquests of England, one by Scandinavian raiders in the 9th century, and one by their converted, French-speaking, distant descendants in 1066. The legacy of the Viking Age is woven, often invisibly, into the fabric of the modern world. Linguistically, English retains hundreds of Norse loanwords: sky, window, knife, husband, law, they, them, and there, among them, evidence of the deep linguistic mixing that occurred in the Danelaw. Political institutions descended from the Thing assembly survive in the very names of modern parliaments, Iceland's Althing, and the etymological root of England's own concept of the husting. Genetic studies have confirmed substantial Norse ancestry across the British Isles, Ireland, and coastal regions from Normandy to the Baltic, reflecting centuries of settlement, intermarriage, and cultural blending rather than simple conquest and departure. Modern Iceland preserves the Old Norse language in remarkably conservative form, allowing Icelanders today to read medieval sagas with relative ease. The Vikings, who emerge from careful historical and archaeological study, then, are neither the horned-helmeted savages of popular caricature nor the sanitized, purely heroic explorers of some modern revisionism, but something more complex and more human, farmers driven by land scarcity and political upheaval to become the most audacious seafarers of their age, traders who linked Baghdad to Newfoundland in a single, staggering commercial network, settlers who founded cities, kingdoms, and legal traditions that still echo in the modern world, and yes, raiders whose violence, including the slave trade at the heart of their economy, left genuine trauma across the medieval world they touched. To understand them fully requires holding both truths simultaneously: the terror they inflicted on unprotected monasteries and river towns, and the extraordinary reach of their ships, their laws, their language, and their blood, which still flow, quietly, through the modern world they helped to shape.